scenes, where how you want to make sure that you're keeping this person quiet, or how to do it. You heard the legal side of it. Very, very important. Now is the next step, and most of our lawyers, I believe all of them, when they come to those scenes on an on-call situation, they're going to suggest to you that you call Ken Wolf. 248-217-1677. Everybody knows the number now. And he's the guy that you need to, and that's because he's taking care of the emotional side of this. And I want you to know for the POAM members and your families, the lifeline exists for all of you. We're not going to go into that detail on that tonight, but I mean, we have domestic problems. We don't know who calls them. That's all we'll know is that he got this many calls. And that's because we want to make sure we're publicizing it enough. But if there's problems at home, problems with your kids, he handles all of those things as well, or can certainly make a referral. But today, we're going to talk about the surviving the critical incident. As a person that is involved in it directly, the person that has come to the scene, or the people that were witnesses, and it really that net goes very wide. Can be the guy who was off duty, that wishes he was there. Can be so many things. And so Ken's going to go into that for us today, and we appreciate you being here, Ken.
Thank you. Good afternoon. When you need backup on the street, you call another department, a bunch of people come. When you need emotional backup, who do you call? The lifeline is there for you, for the officers, for the reps, and how to support people after critical incidents in general, and shooting events in particular. And you know, an officer-involved shooting is one of the worst events. One of them. I think responding to the school yesterday in Texas is another one, where you're confronted by horror, by doubt, by pain, by suffering. But when you're involved in an officer-involved shooting, it's you. It's your family, it's your department, it's your peers. One of the things that we were talking about earlier was when I was talking to some of the business agents, we found out about, and the lawyers mentioned it too, there was some shooting events that didn't hit their radar until a week or two later. Or somebody read about it in the newspapers. You know, immediacy of response is going to be very helpful for those officers, witnesses, people involved in that critical incident. And we're going to go through the stages of crisis reactions so you'll understand why. You know, law enforcement, as we all know, has its joys when you save a baby, when you do something like that. But we're experienced firsthand, unfiltered, to human misery. Negative public image. You know, people always seem to have a negative thing, the scrutiny. You see death and pain in a raw, unfiltered way, and you experience more pain other than EMTs and maybe firefighters than most people see, and there's always that scrutiny. The people with 20/20 hindsight are trying to figure out, what did you do last Saturday night? And they have 4 days to reconstruct and fill in a lot of missing information that wasn't available at the scene. And you know, trauma affects us all. We're human beings. We're moms. We're dads. We're spouses. We're individuals, as well as that look underneath the uniform and the badge. And what is the impact of continuing traumatic scenes on us? And when I would interview people in the academy, I would say, when do you want to become a police officer, a corrections officer? And say, I want to help people. I want to make a difference in my community. And then, over a period of years, you build up emotional calluses. Because you got to protect yourself from the raw pain that you see on a daily basis. We call that compassion fatigue. This critical incident stress, the line of duty kinds of events. There's PTSD, where after some critical incidents, some people to greater or lesser amounts may have a post-traumatic stress reaction. And then there's something called burnout. I've had enough. I want to build my cabin in the Upper Peninsula on 10 square acres with no run in and no road out. And you know, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and daily loss and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as going through a puddle or a river of water and not getting wet. So the question is, you have all the tactical training. You have, you know, how do you do this? How do we do this? How do we approach a scene? We're here to talk about the emotional training, so you understand what's happening to you either while or right after you did it, so you don't become an emotional casualty. A shooting is a life-altering event. You know, you become a member of a very unique club, probably one you never wanted to join. Because you're the woman, you're the guy who actually took a life. You had to show your presence of mind, your discipline, your professionalism under fire. And you survived, you emerged. But we all know academically, yeah, something like that may happen, yeah, it'll happen. But when it happens, it's real, it's powerful, and in terms of the impact on us and our families, it's often life-altering. And there's a ripple effect. You, your family, your peers, your department, the community, the families involved, even the families of the person who's deceased, because we never know how they're going to process this. So the usual contexts are domestics, robbery in progress, burglaries, traffic offenses, stakeouts, and hostage situations. Look at what happened yesterday, where they got to the scene. He had the kids in that 4th grade room. It was a big shootout, 2 officers got shot. You know, in that fray, did any of our bullets hit any of those kids? You know, we wonder about what happened. And while we obviously saved a lot more lives, you respond to a scene with incomplete information. And you gotta make decisions, right? Taking control is what we do when there's chaos and panic. You know, we can't call a committee meeting with a 911, and when we show up, we gotta stabilize the scene based upon what we can see and what facts we have. So it's a profound event. It affects our families. There's gonna be a process of actions we cannot control. One of which is, you know, what is my future gonna look like? How will I see myself? How will my family see me? Got to go through rigorous examinations by department investigations, internal, you know, MSP. Is there going to be discipline? Is it going to be a good shoot? Is it going to be a bad shoot? There's a period of uncertainty, one where you're trying to deal with, you know, I'm alive and I'm not dead. But then all these other real world forces, many of which are out of your control, that we got to start thinking about. Is there going to be criminal, civil court actions? You know, they were talking about how law enforcement or the attorneys general is going back 2-3 years, reviewing what we thought were closed incidents, and that's generating a lot of insecurity and concern. The unwanted media attention, and also fear of retaliation. I just saw a guy who killed somebody, the guy stabbed him. And there were 3 other buddies this guy had after he stabbed this person a bunch of times. And now he's saying, oh, his buddy's going to come out. Are they going to retaliate against me? The event may be over, but the ripple effect may be not. And it's characterized by a lot of uncertainty. And what is a critical incident? A critical incident is an event outside of the range of normal human experience that would be distressing to almost anybody. It usually entails a life-altering kind of event. It's usually sudden, it's overwhelming, And sometimes it's characterized by a lack of control over the situation. I didn't think this guy was going to do it. He saw we were here. How did he make that decision that I now was put in a position that I had to shoot him? And, you have to process that. They're unexpected, and it's distressing to almost anybody. LAPD did a study of post-shooting trauma reactions officers have. It's not like, you take the officer's weapon at the scene, guy goes home. How do they relive it that night, in the next few days, in the next few weeks, in the next few years? And the reactions, 55% had heightened senses of danger. 49% had a tremendous sense of anger and blaming. Why did this person do it? Why did it have to happen? They're angry on multiple levels, and one of the reasons of anger is my life is different now because of the decision I made that night, and I'd rather be boring and anonymous than all over the place, in the papers, in investigations, in a lot of people's sites. And I got to deal with the consequences of that evening. Very often they have nightmares. They dream about the shooting. Bad guy shoots them. They shoot the bad guy. Very often people want to isolate. They want to withdraw. Nobody understands what I went through. And they don't want any more stimulation because they got enough stimulation bouncing around in their head like ping pong balls, reliving, dealing with the doubt, the emotional reactions of that event. Anxiety about the future, sleep difficulties. A very frequent one is slideshows. You ask the officer, I wasn't at the scene, could you recreate the scene for me? So they tell you about the slideshow, frame by frame by frame. And then a lot of them have flashbacks, and they see the event over and again. They're watching TVs, an intrusive memory. The scene pops into their head. And if you don't know that these are normal critical incident and post-traumatic stress reactions, you think you're losing your mind. You want to forget about that scene, not relive it 300-400 times a day. So when you start explaining to the officer that these are the normal reactions normal officers have after a critical incident, what you're doing is you're giving them control over their symptoms, because otherwise they feel that their lives and their brains are out of control and they don't know, how can I get back to who I used to be? Recovery is a process. In other words, the stages of critical incident of post-traumatic stress, and any of you have been in the military with the combat stress teams, you see people coming back from Iraq, from Afghanistan. You go through stages of recovery. And one of the things we do when we see the officers is educate them about what are the predictable, normal reactions normal police officers have in order to give them control over their symptoms. Otherwise, they feel like they're going crazy and they lose a sense of hope. There's a rule of 1/3. 1/3 of the officers will usually have almost no reactions. 1/3 may have a mild reaction. 1/3 will have a moderate reaction. 2% may have post-traumatic stress disorder. So you want to immediately get with the officer and tell them about the stages of recovery. You predict and prepare them for what to expect. And once they understand it, they're action-oriented decision makers. They understand the process. And then as it happens, it's less distressful for them. So in terms of the officer-involved shooting in particular, there are, usually short-term periods of distress. There's self-coping, I got to take care of myself. I got doubt, I got worried. You go home that night and you say, something, that could be me on the pavement. And if that was me on my pavement with the bullet holes in me instead of in the bad guy, who's going to take care of my kids? Who's going to take care of my family? You have a confrontation, almost existential, with your existence. You're forced to confront your mortality. You're forced to confront life and death issues in a way when we put on our leather in the morning, we never think about this kind of stuff. You talk to peers, you talk to psychologists. You know, the concept of peer support team, we've been training a lot of peers in different departments throughout the state. The intermediate reaction usually impact stages, the first 22 to 72, first 24, 72 hours. Then we go into the impact stage where the shock, disbelief, denial that this happened wears off, and we're sitting at home, and all of a sudden we get hit with tremendous cataclysms of emotion, anger, rage. And I think if you picked it up, we had that whole list of post-traumatic symptoms. We had the POAM article, so you have a reference to go back. And you try and understand it, and then you have good days and you have bad days. Good days, you can put it out in your mind, you have a sense of peace. Bad days, you're reliving it, and it's very painful. And you're functioning, you know, you withdraw. Your mind is reliving the shooting instead of doing what you normally would do. There's a need for support, somebody to say, I care about you, we're there, we're behind you. And you want to get feedback during the administrative procedures. What's happening with IA? What's happening with MSP? What's happening with the prosecutor? Are they going to rule it a good shoot? Is it going to be a bad shoot? These are career-altering kinds of questions and decisions. So, you know, we got to look at our life priorities, and then we got to figure out how do we cope and grow through trauma. Sometimes people have a breakdown, they can't function. They get stuck. They don't want to leave their homes because there's a fear of a repetition, feelings of vulnerability. You know, the investigation looks like it's going against me. How scary. Am I going to lose my house? Am I going to get sued? And is there any support from the department? Well, we know they got to do an investigation. There's some command officers who come over and say, I care about you. Is the union rep saying, we're behind you, we're going to support you, this is a difficult time, you will get better. You create an expectancy of recovery. And what happens with the community? You know, are we going to have social unrest outside of our precinct? Or is the community going to say, thank you for the job you've been doing? We were at Ground Zero, and we spoke to some of the guys in the NYPD, and they were astounded that citizens, after they saw the sacrifices that officers did, while everybody was running away from the towers, the transit authority guys, the firefighters, were running into the building. And they realized the heroism that you, in a silent way, confront every single day. And they said, we couldn't believe that people were thanking us. So the immediate impact right after a shooting in the officer's mind now is, in a sense, relief. I'm alive, he's dead, and I'm glad I'm here. Sometimes there's an acceleration, a real excitement. I'm still here. But then later, you start thinking about, was it a good shoot? Self-doubt. How are other people going to see it? Did I really have to shoot the person? Were there other options of levels of force available to me? They made me do it, particularly in suicide by cops. You speak to the officers who were involved in suicide by cops, they said, the guy made a decision and I had to shoot him. And now I got to live with, even though I took this job to save lives, I now took a life. And then there's a feeling of remorse. You just ruminate in your mind. Self-doubt, I'm a killer. Feelings of being detached. And sometimes you get comments by peers, buddy, that was a great shot. And you know, very often the officers themselves who are saying it are saying, thank God it was him and not me who pulled that trigger. Because I see what they're going through. So it's not a badge of honor when these things happen. It's a sad moment for the community, for the officer, and everybody involved. And then there's often an anger, you know something, I put my life on the line to defend the community, I did what I had to do, and now I feel like I'm the criminal. All these investigations, all this scrutiny. Officer, did you really feel that your life was in danger? Did you have any other options of force to use? They weren't there at that time, at that split second, when that action occurred. And very often they're insensitive to know what's going on in the head of the officer there. And then over a period of weeks, maybe months, you come to a resolution, an acceptance of what happened. And you say, the event is over, I have to recalibrate my thinking and start looking at the future. Where is my career right now? Am I marked? Am I trusted? Are people going to feel confident with me? And sometimes recovery is compromised by being on leave under the investigations, the ongoing fear of 4 months later, is the family going to go sue me? Is somebody else going to get me involved in litigation? And if you're action-oriented, you want to get back on the streets, and yet you're on leave very often for a week, for a month, until there's a finding by the prosecutor. And what do now that your life rhythm, the job that you love, you can't do, but you think about it all day long? And what are the psychological baggage, the aftermath that still haunts you? IACP came up with a bunch of guidelines to protect officers. And a lot of times we'll get calls from POAM through the lifeline. You know, an officer comes in, the chief will call. I'll say, do you have any guidelines on what to do now? No. Do you know anything about the IACP guidelines? No. So we'll send it to the chief so they can see we're not making something up as we go along, but there are national guidelines that informed and professional departments follow. They talk about pre-incident preparation. The time to prepare for a shooting is a month or a year before the shooting. Do you have an infrastructure in your department where you train command, union reps, and people to know what are the reactions if there's a shooting event? Do you have predefined police resources who know the police culture and what the shootings are like to send the officers to for support? And know the confidentiality issues. In other words, the lawyers were very specific. You know, you want to be very careful who you talk to, because anything you say by a peer in the beauty parlor, or if you tell something to your wife and she says it to somebody, and that may be reverberating and it's leaked out, may not be in your best interest. So at the scene, what you want to do is give psychological first aid. You want to have a companion officer, be it a trained peer, be it a friend of the individual, say, this is a horrible scene, let's get out of here. Don't leave the officer alone, because he may be in shock, disbelief, denial, a numbness. And what you want to do is try and help restore the officer's sense of safety. Let's go back to the department. Would you like a Pepsi? Would you like a Coke? Or would you like coffee? You start having them make decisions to reassert the sense of them being in control. And if the officer needs to talk, again, only use privileged personnel. I always tell the officers, the only people who never talk about this incident is to your priest, to your minister, to your attorney, and to your shrink. Don't talk about anybody else about what happened, because it may surface in ways you never anticipated. You can talk about some of your reactions, but never talk about the incident. The issue about replacement weapons. You know, if you take the officer's weapon away at the scene, you give him another one. We work with the U.S. Marshal Service, and when they have shootouts and they take away the office, they always give them a replacement office at the scene. So the officer doesn't feel vulnerable, doesn't feel naked. So the action steps are: expect confusion, get your union and legal counsel immediately with the officer, explain the protocols as to what they can expect, and then know the psychological reactions. And a lot of times, we'll tell, and I think the lawyers also mentioned it, if you just got involved in a shooting and you're trying to figure out, am I dead or am I alive, and somebody says, write a statement, you may have confusion, forgetfulness. You can write an idiotic statement, which 6 months later is going to be used in an investigation or a plaintiff lawsuit. We usually counsel command, don't have the guy touch a piece of paper until he's initially processed this event, because his cognitive and thinking abilities may be impaired and it may look foolish. So you support the officer until they're emotionally stabilized, and then you ask them to give you the statement. So you want to have trained peers. You want to consider what we call critical incident stress debriefings. In other words, you may want to do this for all the people at the scene. You may want to do it for the department. You want to have a family group. We had a situation where there was an ambush on a police station, and the spouses, they eventually shot the bad guy. The spouses were terrified. An officer-involved shooting is the spouse's worst nightmare realized. So we had groups just for the family members so they could vocalize their concerns and bring healing to the whole group in the aftermath of the event. And whenever you have somebody who's intimately involved or a witness, you never put them in a group. You never put them in a group because if it's a peer critical incident stress debriefing group, they do not have patient-therapist confidentiality. The people who are most at risk, you only have them seen one-on-one by a licensed mental health professional, a chaplain, because they're licensed. They don't have to give testimony. There's nothing you can subpoena. Or some of the peer counselors. So it's very important. You protect people in the aftermath of a shooting because you know what's going to happen in a month or 3 months later, where they're just trying to figure out, am I alive or not? And then you recommend to the officer to shoot their weapon before they go back, because shooting the weapon may be a trigger reaction for them to relive the scene. So if they're going to have a post-traumatic reaction, you want it in the safety of the range with a range officer, rather than they're back on the street and the event happens and then they freeze. You often say, visit the scene, go by, while they're on leave, the scene, and see what kinds of memories and thoughts come into your head. Because if you're in that community, sooner or later, you may have to drive by that street, drive by that house, and a normal reaction would be a trigger reaction at that time. You want to prepare the officer that if it happens, you are safe now, the event is over, but at least they know what to expect. Some of the reactions that people will say when they're trying to balance, did I do the right thing? Well, I saved a mom and 2 kids. This was from a domestic run where they shot the abuser. And one guy was just, well, am I a killer? I never see myself as a killer. I never thought I'd be a killer. Was this right? Was it justified? How do you process that image when you join the department to become a life saver? One guy was divorcing his wife, and this was a buddy of mine. And I took for granted he was involved in a shooting. And I said, are you okay? But I didn't really go through it with him. And then he suddenly tells me 3 months later he's getting divorced. Married 23 years with 2 kids. I said, how come? He said, if my goddamn wife let me apply to that other department in Colorado, I wouldn't have been at that scene where that guy came and almost killed me, and I killed him, so I'm going to divorce her. In other words, he still didn't get over that he was attacked. He was partially cut, and then he killed the guy while he was, assaulting him. And his whole life would have been different had he left the department early. He never processed the event, and I naively thought he was okay, but we didn't do what was called a formal critical incident debriefing. We had another guy who was involved in a shooting, and most of the guys on that team did fine. He wouldn't leave his house. When he had to leave his house, he would call the department and say, "He sent a car here, I gotta go to Myers, I gotta go to the store." He was so traumatized, he felt that the other bad guys were gonna come after him, and he felt very, very vulnerable. And over a period of 2 months of working through the event, he's now back at work, working full-time, doing great. Some of the things you gotta think about is, in Macomb County, there was a shooting, and it was a suicide by cop deal. So one of the officers, when we were doing the briefing, said, somebody came up to my kid in school and said, "Your dad's a killer. Your dad is killing people in the community." And he didn't anticipate that. So one of the things you do when you do counseling with the officers in the department, say, "You know what? There are some people who may approach your kids. What did you tell your kid about the shooting?" "Well, I didn't tell him nothing." I said, "Well, maybe what you should do is sit down with your family, explain it in a calm way that an event happened where it was critical that you had to get involved in a shooting event. And this is what happened. I'm okay, I'm safe. What are the questions you have?" In other words, you don't exclude the kids because kids hear the discussion between him and his wife. Kids look at the TV, they figure out that's my mom and dad in that event. If you explain to them, work it through, you reinforce the family bond rather than everybody's in their own head. What happened? What did my daddy really do? If my daddy was dead, who's going to take care of me? So one of the guys brought in a picture that his 8-year-old kid drew. We said, "Ask your kids what happened." So this 9-year-old kid, I think he was 9, drew a picture of a police car, of 4 other police cars, of the bad guy shooting at the cops and bullets flying. So we said to the dad, "Go back and tell your kid, that is a great picture. Explain to me how you came up with the ideas. You want your kids to put into words their fears and their anxieties rather than go turn on the cartoons, kid. You want to deal with their anxieties so they're not traumatized any more than they are." And sometimes the issue of, am I being labeled a shooter, the bad guy, by the department or by the community? So these are things that people don't usually talk about, but are often going through their heads that we want you to be aware of. So when that critical incident happens, you call the lifeline, you call your lawyers, you call your business reps, so we can mobilize an emotional and supportive response. And this ain't the movies. And you ain't Rambo, you ain't a superhero, you ain't Wonder Woman. You're a human being first, and a police officer second. And when you get involved in these terribly intense events, this is how people process it. And the reactions in general are shock, disbelief, denial, and numbness. There's a frozen frame. So if a guy is in shock or a woman's in shock and you got to give a statement and they can't recall everything, or they're reliving the event instead of paying attention to writing a report, it'll look, bad. Senses get heightened. In other words, instantaneously, your sense of sound or vision, your tunnel vision, you focus on what is the threat, where's the person's weapon. And then a day or two later, you go into the impact stage. You're sitting there, why me? Anger, fear, terror, grief, a feeling of powerless and helplessness. My life has been taken away from me. Can't go to work. They're making investigations about me. I don't know what's going to happen to me. Am I going to get sued? Do I have to take my house and put it in my wife's name? What about my truck? There was one unit that went in and a guy murdered his family, and then people saying, well, they didn't get there fast enough. So some of the officers were saying, you know what, I better get everything out of into my wife's name in case I get sued. And there they did great life-saving work. But these are the fears people have. There's confusion, sorrow, self-blame. Why me? And you gotta sort this, and if you're sitting alone watching TV all alone, there's nobody to sound it out for you to help guide your thinking through a very traumatic period. And usually after an emotional roller coaster, trial going up and down, you get a resolution, you get an event closure, and you go forward. The way in which people experience critical incidents, and it's not just officers, it's anybody in an accident, a shooting, a fire, my house got burned down, a hurricane. You have intrusive images. The images come back to your head and then they plague you. I can't get them out of my head. Nightmares, flashbacks, intense reactions to trigger events. Trigger events is something's going to happen that's going to cause you to flash back to the scene. For example, when we had the 255 plane crash, it happened in August, right? What happens Labor Day weekend? Everybody has barbecues. So while they're cooking food on the barbecue, if you remember, 156 people burned to death, and they couldn't do enough body extrication quickly. People, when they smelled the burn, the cookout, they had a memory of the jet fuel and the people burning. Shots fired. You go to a war movie, you go to a cop movie, you hear shots fired, you may flash back to the scene where your gun was being fired. That's why we get people to go to the range, so when they fire their weapon, if they're going to have a trigger reaction, they do it in a safe setting. Seeing, sensing, that was going on. That's why you tell the officer, drive by the house. Because if you're going to have flashbacks, have it when you're safe. Say, that's my unwanted friend. They told me it's going to happen. It happened because that's how people recover from critical incidents, but I'm not losing my mind. Anniversaries, media, every time you got to write a report, you are going to relive that scene. And people have tremendous impacts of, in a life and death situation, you lose your sense of immortality. You lose your sense of invulnerability. And that's the confidence you have every day when you go out on the streets. You lose your sense of safety and security. Particularly with some of these ambushes that are going on around the country. Sense of justice, sense of trust. Who can you trust? You can't, trust some of these citizens. You lose your sense of future. The future I thought I was going to have before the shooting may be endangered, it may be compromised, and I don't know what to expect. And that doubt can eat away. People have a sense maybe of embarrassment, fear of scrutiny. What's the status of my organization? Are they going to see me a chump or as a hero? Am I going to get promoted? Am I going to be ostracized? Another issue is, if it happened once, it can happen again. A fear of a repetition. What happens on the next stop? People come out shooting just like this one. What about on the next domestic? So you have to be very vigilant. And, there's a fear of symptoms. These are very uncomfortable reactions. And working through the reaction is helping the officer label those feelings, telling them these are the normal reactions normal people have, and understanding how do you answer the question, why you? Because you had the bad luck of doing that run. Now that you put it into words, are you going to let it pull you down? Are you going to be a survivor, or are you going to be a victim? And what are the qualities of a survivor? And a lot of times, we don't like to talk about our vulnerability. People may doubt me if I talk about my emotions, my fears, the emotional distance. And one of three things happens after a critical incident. One, you go back to where you were. Okay, let's get back to work. Two, you have a lot of feelings of flashbacks, fear of a repetition, doubt, loss of confidence, and you get stuck. The other thing that can happen is, in the aftermath of a critical incident, having survived the test of life and death, of fire under comma, and you came out alive, you have both confidence in your ability to manage an event like this. And often people's priorities change. They think about, if I were killed that day, what would happen to my family? You look at your life priorities and you say, what's most important in my life? And people suddenly say, my love for my kids, doing things with significant others, going fishing. And it's not whether you have a big house or a little house or a red shirt or a blue shirt. It's whether you live or die. And with that knowledge, you rework your life priorities so you do all the things that give you a sense of replenishment and fulfillment with your life. So, we're helping the helpers, but who are we? Who is a police officer? You know, the law enforcement personality is somebody who's highly motivated, action-oriented. We're risk takers. We can't stand sitting around doing nothing. We can't stand boredom, which is why we get into this stuff. And often we're perfectionistic. We need to be in control. Black, white. You know, you can't have gray when you go to a scene. You've got to make a decision and try and take control. If that decision works, you redo the decision, and you don't have the luxury somebody 3 days later say, well, why did you do this or that? You've got to make decisions on incomplete information. So there's little acceptance of fallibility. Sometimes we're very harsh on ourselves and one another, and shame is a worse emotion than fear. I don't want to be shamed. And within this all or nothing value system, you know, the inability to suck it up or snap out of it may be perceived by others, maybe I'm a loser. Maybe they're going to have doubts. Maybe they don't want to go back and be my partner on the street again. And you know what? We learn to hide our emotions, don't we? You know, the code of silence. We don't want to talk about frailties. So, are we happy? Are we depressed? Are we pensive? Are we angry? Are we excited? Are we suicidal? What is our stress mask? And who do we really share? What's going on in our head? And you know, the stigma paradox, if I call a shrink, if I ask for some help, if I ask for peer support, I will not be allowed to save lives if I ask for help to save mine. You know, the suicide rate of officers is about 123 per 100,000 people. The general population is 8. We're killing ourselves more than the bad guys are killing us. So when we look at somebody who's depressed, who's drinking too much, who's angry, who's bitter, do we go over and say, hey, I care about you, let's get you into some of the resources counseling because I care about you and your future, or do we just sort of ignore it? And you know, stress, there are all different kinds of stress, work-life stresses, and it takes a burden on us, the fight or flight reaction. And this cumulative stress, a bunch of things over time can add up, or you get involved in a line of duty critical incident stress. The cumulative stresses are like feelings of depression, suicidal thinking, burnout, self-doubt, problems with the significant other, problems with the kids, sleep deprivation, I don't know what kinds of shifts you're on, you get adequate sleep, a sense of powerlessness and frustration with the criminal justice system. The guys in one of the departments where this guy opened up on the department and ambushed him, you know, they shot the guy and he went back, and they were furious less at the guy than at the prosecutor because this guy had 3 previous incidents. One where he took a bow and arrow and tried to shoot a bunch of police officers. Then there was a holiday parade, he tried to run over a firefighter. Then he goes to the house, the station, and he opens fires on the house. So they would think about, is the prosecutor going to let this guy out and give him another chance to kill us again? And when you realize this helplessness, you know, why catch him, they disperse him, whatever, it's a feeling of anger. The fear of injury, problems with command. And you know, peer support, but I'm not drowning you. And you got depression, substance abuse, divorce around you. So what is a critical incident? And these are called line of duty critical incidents that most departments will develop protocols for. The violent death of an officer in the line of duty, really, that's the worst outcome. Shooting someone being shot at in the line of duty. Suicide of a fellow officer, responding to multiple fatalities. Responding to or handling infant mortality. The innocent kid whose life is taken away by a vicious individual. Gruesome or unusual homicide, traumatic injuries of being assaulted, high-speed chases inadvertently, resulting in injuries, feeling helpless at a scene. You go to a scene, there's nothing you can do, despite your professionalism, your training, and your motivation, you don't know, there's nothing you can do because of the circumstances. Domestic incidents and child abuse. You know, even if we put this guy or other into custody, are they going to be back it again? Taking a life in the line of duty, suicides. And the barricaded gunmen. I mean, that's what happened yesterday when they had to, and we don't have enough to know what actually happened at the scene. Handling prolonged rescue operations and the victims expired. The guys who went to Sandy Hook, and they had to see all those dead children and faculty. And, you know, the fear, the kids are our future. We want to protect those we love and the children that we love. And you run to the scene and you try and stabilize it. And people are shooting at you while you're putting your life on the line. And 2 of the officers got shot yesterday responding to that scene. You know, this was the chaplain for the fire department. Somebody jumped out the 95th floor, landed on him while he was giving last rites to one of the people there. People running away, you know, the fires. These guys from the NYPD, what they were doing is, when the towers came down, it flattened everything like a pancake. And they were looking for anything that would be a badge, a weapon, credit card. For some reason, the credit cards were still there, because you wanted to get DNA, you wanted to be able to identify people. And then when they would find a police officer or a firefighter, they would stop the excavation, have the pipes, and have an armor guard take the person out. And we salute and respect our fallen. And our professionalism tries to always make sure we never fall. In the Pentagon, you know, the same thing. Who would believe that we'd be under attack? This was in Katrina in Fort Apache, in Louisiana. The officers had a tremendous double bind. Do we go home and protect our own kids, or do we go into the community and protect the community? There was looting, there was shooting. The police cars ran out of gas. They didn't have electricity. So where is our allegiance to our family or to our community? It created tremendous conflicts. And then at 255, with that shooting, there was tremendous destruction, and you're just not used to it. General Douglas MacArthur said, the second best decision quickly made is better than the best decision never made. You're exercising, you're doing all these active shooter drills, your constant training tries to give you the confidence and the skills to go to these scenes and take control of it. Don't sit around and debate. And when people need help, and when officers need help after a critical incident, you know, Beetle Bailey is saying the sergeant's hanging out on a bridge. Do you need help? He says, I need help, you idiot. So Beetle Bailey says, he gets a psychiatrist and says, tell me about your mother and father. In the aftermath of a critical incident, you want to do crisis intervention support. You want to educate the officer, the peers, the witnesses in the department. What are the stages of crisis reactions? And departments now, and POAM is pushing this statewide. Joint policies and SOPs. After a critical incident, this is how we protect the officers. These are the emotional impacts. And these are the protocols we want to have to give them safe refuge to talk about what's happening so they don't become emotional casualties. You want to train command supervisors and union reps. What are the stages of crisis recovery after a line of duty critical incident? You want to have identified mental health teams, so if you need that kind of credential, and I mean support where they have patient therapists to appear immunity from talking, they're identified and you're not scrambling, wasting precious time. And we're looking at consortium areas, in other words, some areas where there are not an abundance of mental health resources. How can we identify people so they'll go to that department and immediately offer support? The confidentiality is very important. One, You don't want something to be said while somebody is still in a state of shock that then compromises the investigation of affecting their career or the image of them in the departments. There are usually 3 types of crisis interventions we do for line of duty critical incident. One is individual sessions, and there you have absolute patient therapists. We do an assessment, is this a good shoot or a bad shoot? If it's a good shoot, there's less of a concern doing things in a group. If there's going to be scrutiny, liability, lawsuits, you really minimize group contact, because anything that is said is not privileged. It could show up in a different form. And then you want to do family support for the families, because that's their fears coming true. What we call critical incident stress management programs, they're joint and confidential. You work out the policies with command so everybody knows what you can and can't do. It's non-investigatory. IA is going to look at what happened. The crisis teams look at, it's over, how do we help people recover and not be harmed in their career or their personal lives. And you coordinate it with chaplains, peers. The goal, as I said, in a critical incident is to reduce the trauma of the incident. You educate the officer, this is what to expect. You give them an opportunity that's safe to ventilate and validate what are the feelings, what are the thoughts, emotions that they have, and you predict and prepare them for what they will have in the next few days or next few months, so when it happens, they don't think they're going crazy. It's a technical psychiatric term. And very often, if you have a group and everybody says, yeah, I felt this way, yeah, I got nauseous at the scene, yeah, I was dreaming about the event, it offsets the fallacy of uniqueness. I'm the only one having these reactions. You legitimize the reactions, and then they say, gee, this really is the normal reactions that people have. You help people develop a coping plan. The critical question I ask every deputy or every officer is, what was the worst part of this event for you? Well, I almost killed a 6-month-old kid when I shot the dad. Or, I felt I didn't get there quick enough. That's a critical question, because that's where the individual is going to get stuck. So then what I'll do is I'll try and get them to say, okay, how can we deal with that? How can you reframe that thought so it's not going to haunt you? And then you link them to helping resources. Might be the EAP, it might be the new cadre of peer teams we're training throughout the state, might be to Lifeline. The people affected by, and this is for a big department model, I'm out of the Sheriff's Department in Wayne County, and then I was also with Detroit PD. There we had a whole bunch of different groups. We had officers, dispatchers, corrections command, EMTs, PIOs, civilian personnel, the families, SWAT units, aero units, dive teams, canine units, emergency operations center, mutual aid, and the crisis team itself. Those are the people that you identify, and you offer different levels of support, because when an event happens to your police family, that ripple effect affects all of them, not just the officer. So you get a plan, set the stuff up, look at the role of peers. And remember, Lincoln said the best deed in the world after creating a human life is saving a human life. Isn't that why you became an officer?